Okay, so today I'm going to be reading to pages 257 to 268, and I want you to follow along in your Johnny Tremain copy. So Johnny slept. It was daylight when he woke with Warren's hand upon his shoulder. Outside on Tremont Street, he could hear the clumping of army boots. A sergeant was swearing at his men. The soldiers were paraded so close to the house, which stood flush with the sidewalkless street, that Johnny at first thought they must be in the room. Dr. Warren dared speak no louder than whisper. "I'm going now." "Something's happened?" "Yes." He motioned Johnny to follow him into the kitchen. This room was on the back of the house. They could talk without danger of being overheard by the troops in the street. Dr. Warren had on the same clothes as the day before. He had not been to bed. But now his hat was on his head, his black bag of instruments and medicines was packed in on the table. Silently he put milk, bread, herrings beside it, and gestured to Johnny to join him. "Where did it begin?" asked Johnny. "Lexington." "Who won?" "They did. 700 against 70. It wasn't a battle. It was just target practice for them. Some of our men were killed, and the British huzzayed and took the road to Concord," meaning that they celebrated. "And did they get our supplies there?" "I don't know. Paul Revere sent for me just after the firing on Lexington Green." The young man's usually fresh-colored face was haggard. He knew the seriousness of this day for himself and for his country. But everywhere the alarm is spreading. Men are grabbing their guns, marching for Concord. Paul Revere did get through in time last night. Billy Dawes a little later. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Minutemen are on the march. Before the day's over, there'll be real fighting, not target practice. But Gage doesn't know that it's begun. You see, long before Colonel Smith got to Lexington, just as soon as he heard that Revere had warned the country, he sent back for reinforcements. For Earl Percy, you and I, Johnny, are just about the only people in Boston who know that blood has already been shed. Were many killed at Lexington? No, not many. They stood up, just a handful. The British fired on them. It was dawn. Johnny licked his lips. "Did they tell you the names of those killed?" "No." "Did Rab get out in time?" "Yes, last Sunday." The doctor's clear blue eyes darkened. He knew what was in Johnny's mind. He picked up his bag. "I've got to get to them. They'll need surgeons. Then, too, I'd rather die fighting than on a gallows. Gage won't be so lenient now, as soon as he learns war has begun." "Wait until I get my shoes on." "No, Johnny, you are to stay here today. Pick up for me any information. For instance, out of my bedroom window I can see soldiers standing the length of the street way over to the common. You find out what regiments are being sent and all that. And today go and listen to what folk are saying, and the names of any of the British arrests. We know Gage expects to move his men back here tonight. If so, there'll be a lot of confusion getting them into town. You watch your chance and slip out to me." "Where I'll find you?" "God knows. Ask about." "I will do so. They've begun it. We'll end it. But this war may last quite a long time." They shook hands, silently. Johnny knew that Warren was always conscious of the fact that he had a crippled hand. Everybody else had accepted and forgotten it. The back door closed softly. Warren was gone. Johnny went to the surgery, put on his boots and jacket. The wall clock said 8 o'clock. It was time to be about. There was no leaving by the front door. The soldiers were leaning against it. Through the curtains of the windows he could see the muskets. He noticed the facings of their uniforms. The 23rd Regiment. The narrow course of Tremont Street was filled to the brim and overflowing with the waiting scarlet-coated men, like a river of blood. He left by the kitchen. On Cornhill, Johnny could feel the subdued excitement. Everyone knew something was happening. No one knew what. Doors and windows were open, people hanging out, calling back and forth, or gathered in knots in the street. Johnny kept his eyes and ears open. Everyone knew about that secret expedition last night. Colonel Smith had embarked with 700 men and landed in Cambridge. That Gage was sending over at least 1,000 fresh troops to support him, anyone might guess. But the people of Boston knew no more than Gage that the fighting had begun. Johnny went to the Province House. All was as usual. The sentries were on guard. Young officers lounged about. One was already in his cups. Johnny could see that a group of them were playing at cards in the south parlor. Perhaps they were finishing off the game they had begun last night. He knew which was General Gage's bedroom. The curtains were still drawn. Colonel Smith's early call for reserves evidently had not upset the commanding officer. He had given the order which set Percy's 1st Brigade in motion, had rolled over, and gone to sleep. Johnny went to the common. He had already seen the tail of Percy's brigade lashing around Dr. Warren's house. The head of the Scarlet Dragon lay upon the common. The men were restless, grumbling, spitting, shifting their heavy equipment. Some had already been standing about for 3 hours. Johnny learned from one of their camp women what was causing the delay. They were waiting to be joined by a detachment of Marines. He looked about and saw for himself. These 1,200 men were taking with them cannon and baggage wagons. The tension among the inhabitants was growing. What had happened? What was going to happen? Shops and schools were closed, and Johnny met a wreath of tiny children advancing and chanting, "School is done, war has begun." It looked to him they were shrewder guessers than their elders, who were trying to believe that not a shot had been or would be fired. Then, from over North Boston way, came the brisk rattle of drums. The 500 Marines, billeted all about North Square, arrived at double quick. They took their places in the ranks. Some were still buckling their equipment or eating the bread that had been tossed to them. They had been hours late, but when they had been notified, they came fast. Tagging after them, looking half awake and half dressed, Johnny recognized an old acquaintance. It was Madge, even fatter since her marriage and seemingly more in love than ever. Tears streamed down her thick red cheeks, and all animosity forgotten, she flung herself upon Johnny. "I can't bear it," she says. "But he says he's got to go." Near by, tough little Sergeant Gale was strutting about like a bantam cock, roaring at one of his men whose buttons did not shine. He was pretending not to know that his wife was so nearby. He was really showing off in front of her and approved her presence. Men went to war and women wept. All was as it should be. "Sure, he's got to go," Johnny comforted Madge, "but people say Gage is just sending out the brigade for exercise. They've been sitting about barracks catching fleas all winter. Why were the Marines late?" Gage sent a letter to Major Pitcairn telling him to parade his men, but Pitcairn wasn't to home. Pitcairn went off last night, second in command to Colonel Smith. "Did you know that? The Marines didn't know until about 10 minutes ago." Johnny had to laugh. It would certainly hearten Dr. Warren when he heard how stupid the British had been. Gage had forgotten the Marine Major had already gone, had sent him a letter, and then turned over for another snooze. Suddenly there was silence along the whole great length of the brigade. Slim Earl Percy, on a white horse, escorted by a group of officers, was cantering slowly across the common. 5 mounted men. The sun was bright on that day, with only breeze enough to ruffle the horses' manes. Flaunt scarlet riding capes. Float the flag of England. Johnny was an Englishman. The sullen, rebellious people standing about watching Percy and his staff approaching, waiting for the brigade to march. All were Englishmen. That flag, it stood for Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Charles I's head upon a block, centuries of struggle for English liberty. But over here, there had grown up a broader interpretation of the word liberty. No man to be ruled or taxed except by men of his own choice. But we are still fighting for English liberty, and don't you forget it. French slaves to the north of us, Spanish slaves to the south of us, only English colonies are allowed to taste the forbidden fruit of liberty. We who grew up under England. Johnny thought of James Otis's words, upholding the torch of liberty, which had been lighted on the fires of England. Not since the soldiers had come to Boston had Johnny removed his hat when the British flag went by, except when it had been knocked off his head by a soldier. He started to remove it now, for the first time, and doubtless the last. Thought better of it. It was too late. He knew the shooting had begun. The sword in Earl Percy's hands flashed. There was a command which was instantly picked up and repeated and echoed and repeated again. The regimental drummers struck up. The artillery horses threw their weight against their collars. Wagoners cracked their whips, and the Scarlet Dragon swung forward, sluggishly at first, heading for the town gates. Thousands of separate feet merged into only one gigantic pair. Left, right, left, right. The earth shook into their rhythm. Johnny watched them pass. Every button was sewed on, every buckle in place, every cartridge box held exactly 36 cartridges. Every musket had a bayonet, and there was not one old fowling piece among them. Every horse had 4 new shoes. It was a magnificent sight, but Johnny felt a little sick. What chance, what shadow of a chance, had those poor, untrained, half-armed farmers at Concord? Oh God, be with us now. But even as he prayed, he kept an eye out for the regimental markings on the men's uniforms. It was the 4th, the 23rd, and the 47th who were being sent out, plus 500 Marines, plus a small artillery train and a few baggage wagons. 1,200 for a guess. The drums throbbed. The heavy dragon marched on its thousands of feet, and now above the drums came the shrilling of the fifes. When they're referring to the heavy dragon, they're not literally meaning a dragon. They are giving you an image of the amount of people in the ranks and the soldiers and what it looked like. It was so heavy. There were so many people that were dressed in red. It looked like one big huge mass. They played a tune they always played when they wished to insult Yankees. For once more, Yankee Doodle was going to town on a spanking stallion with that forlorn feather in his cap, asking those unmilitary questions. Poor Yankee Doodle. Whatever could he do against this great scarlet dragon? The hundreds gathered to see the departure of the brigade stood about, gazing at the empty space they had occupied. Far away, growing faint and fainter, came wafting back the last sound of the tune they played. A man, standing by Johnny with clenched hands and head thrust down and out like a bull's, said thickly, "They go out by Yankee Doodle, but they'll dance to it before night." Johnny saw a group of women, and they were nodding their heads, whispering a prophecy. Before night they'll be dancing. This catchphrase was everywhere. It did not seem to have gone from mouth to mouth, but from mind to mind. Old meeting struck 9. Earl Percy and his laggard brigade were gone. This day, this unreal day in which Boston waited hour upon hour for news, any news, good or bad, was well begun. Suddenly, people were saying, "Have you heard? At sunrise this morning, over at Lexington, the British fired on us." No one seemed to know where this rumor had started, but it was everywhere. Although half of Gage's forces had left town for the battlefield, there were more officers than usual hanging out about the streets and taverns, and their faces were so bland, and they reassured the people so glibly that not a shot had been fired, not a person killed, and begged all and sundry so smoothly to keep calm and go to their shops or their homes. Johnny was confident that the British as well as the inhabitants had heard now that the war had begun. And by noon, little bands of soldiers appeared on the streets, going quickly from house to house. Too late, General Gage had given orders that the leaders of the opposition should be arrested, but the leaders were all gone. The angry, frustrated soldiers might scare Sam Adams' black handmaiden out of her wits. They could break John Hancock's fence, but these gentlemen had quietly left Boston a month before. They stormed into Joseph Warren's house. He was gone, and so was Paul Revere. Not one of the principal leaders was left, and seemingly no rebel printers. Isaiah Thomas's shop was empty. He and his press had left the night before. At Eads and Gill's, where the Boston Gazette was published, they did grab young Peter Eads. His father and press had been smuggled out to Watertown. Robert Newman, suspected of having hung the lanterns in Christ Church the night before, was thrown into jail, and John Pulling, merely suspected of having helped, was forced to hide in his grandmother's wine butt. Paul Revere's cousin was in jail, and every minute the temper of the soldiers was growing shorter, and a queer feeling of jubilation was apparent among the people. You couldn't see, you couldn't guess, why they began feeling so confident. Confidence was in the air. As soon as Johnny heard that arresting parties were on the streets, he sent a message to Uncle Lorne. Uncle had best make himself scarce. Soon after, having stood about the jail and noted exactly who was put in it, he himself headed for Salt Lane. There was not a person on the street, but at every window he saw a face. The lane itself had changed. He glanced about him and saw what was wrong. There was no little man in a blue coat observing Boston through a spyglass. The familiar sign had been torn down, stamped kindling. The door of the shop was shattered. He went in. The presses were broken, the type pied. Upstairs, his and Rob's bed had been ripped open by bayonets. Frightened, he ran across the street. Aunt Jennifer sat in her kitchen. Half in her lap and half on the floor was an enormous feather bed. She was peacefully sitting on it and new ticking. The only usual thing was the great number of feathers this deft housewife had carelessly spilled over her kitchen floor. Rabbit, enchanted with these new toys, was constantly picking up a feather, putting it in his hair, and saying, "Yankee do." "They've been here?" asked Johnny. "Yes." "Are they gone?" "Not one in sight. We got your message just as they were turning down Salt Lane." The feather bed began to heave on the floor. "You can come out now," Aunt Jennifer whispered to it. Out of the bottom rolled Uncle Lorne, choked with feathers and looking more bird than human. Rabbit shrieked, "Dada!" He evidently thought his father much improved. Still trembling, for Uncle Lorne was a timid man, he kissed his wife and hugged his child. "It was all I could think of," Aunt Jennifer said to Johnny. "Mr. Lorne just stood here and said he wasn't afraid to die. We could hear the men marching down the street. It was terrible, so I just popped him in and went on sewing." "Were the soldiers rough?" "Rough? They were furious." "Good," said Johnny grimly. "That means they are really scared. Something pretty awful has happened to all those men Gage sent out. Some of the officers may know already, but the men have guessed it, and they are running about with uniforms unbuttoned and yelling, 'If they want a war, we'll give it to them, and they won't pay taxes, we'll collect in blood.'" "You don't say. Are you sure the fighting's going for us?" "Pretty sure. I was down by the ferry slip and saw a British major coming over from Charlestown. Well, he had a civilian coat over his uniform, sort of disguised, and he tore off the boat and he ran for the Province House. He come to tell Gage Colonel Smith's and Percy's men are getting licked." "Boy, you're jumping at conclusions." "No, not I. I saw his face. It was just done in and tied up with disgust. His uniform was a mess. His feelings had been hurt. People who had been winning battles don't go around with faces like that, but British officers who have been beaten by peasants and yokels do." "Oh, Johnny, I do like to hear you talk like that, but I'm not counting much on one man's face. Where are you off to?" "Beacon Hill. I've an idea that Major got back to Gage to tell him one thing. The British are going to try to get to Charlestown, just the way he did, and under protection of the Somerset's guns. Just the way he did. Oh, sorry, I repeated that. They won't backtrack the way that they came. Too dangerous. If I've guessed it right, before long from Beacon Hill, we'll be able to see them running, and our men after them. Johnny, here's half a mince pie for you." Ooh. Sorry, guys. I almost dropped my phone. There we go. Okay. "Johnny, here's half a mince pie for you. You're a real smart boy. Bits help. Have been picking off feathers, even if they'd..." Oh, I'm sorry. Ooh, wow. Okay, Uncle Lorne came back from the bedroom where he, with Rabbit's help, had been picking off feathers. "Even if they hang me," he said in a proud tremolo, I will feel I have not lived in vain." He was still pretty scared. Out on the street, Johnny met officers yelling at their men, trying to get them back into their barracks, striking at them even with the flat of their swords. You couldn't say the British regulars lacked fight. All they could talk about was how many skulking cowards and damned rebels they were going to kill. And one day, all was changed in Boston. On both sides, the gloves were off and the hands underneath were bloody. War had begun. The pastures and orchards back of Beacon Hill were crowded and all eyes turned northward. Johnny was not the only person who had guessed that Percy would not attempt to get the remains of Smith's troops and his own brigade back through Cambridge, but only to Charlestown, where they could be protected by the Somerset's guns. Then Johnny saw running down Cambridge Road, through the bushes on Charlestown Common, a scurry of red ants. Had he really seen them or imagined them? But all about him people were exclaiming, "Look, there they are!" Those red ants were British soldiers. To his left, the last moment of sunset light was dying. The day had been amazingly warm, but with a night of fresh breeze came up off the ocean. Lights began to glimmer in Charlestown and on warships. Seemingly, there was nothing more to be seen from Beacon Hill. Silently, people turned to go to their houses. "Look!" Johnny cried. You could see the flash of musket fire, too far away to be heard. Fireflies swarming, hardly more than that.